In today's discussion, we're going to talk about social contract theory, which basically is the idea that by living in a society, we agree to give up some of our freedoms in exchange for the security and the benefits that come with it. We'll begin by talking about the different classical views of the social contract, then look at how this theory has influenced modern political thought and its relevance in modern society. And finally, we'll consider some of the criticisms of it. We'll start by considering this concept through the work of three big names in political philosophy: Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Each of these philosophers had their own take on this thing called the state of nature, which is essentially what they thought life would be like without any government at all, when there were no rules, no laws, just total freedom or total anarchy. Would it be a utopia, or would it be total chaos? They really tried to imagine what that would look like, and their personal experiences shaped their ideas about what kind of government we need. For example, how much personal freedom should we be willing to give up in exchange for security? They were trying to figure out the trade-offs and the costs and benefits of living in a society. Let's first look at Thomas Hobbes, perhaps the ultimate pessimist when it came to the human condition. His book, Leviathan, is a classic in political philosophy, a must-read in this field. In it, he basically argues that without a strong ruler, life would just be this constant struggle for power, a war of all against all. One of his famous quotes from the book is that without government, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. I guess we can say that his was not exactly a sunny outlook. I think we can get that things could get out of hand if there were no rules. But was Hobbes really that pessimistic about human nature? We have to consider that he did live through a pretty rough time, the English Civil War, an era that was riddled with massive upheaval and violence. So that definitely colored his view. He saw firsthand how easily things can descend into chaos when there's no authority to keep people in check. He came to believe that there was a need for some kind of order, even if it comes at a price. So for Hobbes, the social contract is about giving up some freedom for security, even if that security required an absolute monarch, the Leviathan. He believed individuals are driven by self-preservation and that they would rationally choose a strong sovereign over the chaos of anarchy. He did acknowledge that this absolute ruler's power came from the people, even though they were giving up quite a bit of their own power in the process. So how does this idea of a super strong ruler play out in modern times? We can see echoes of Hobbesian thinking in arguments for things like strong national security measures, police and intelligence surveillance programs, and even limitations on freedom of expression in the name of preventing terrorism or maintaining order. These state powers are prioritized, sometimes at the expense of individual liberties. This causes us to question if the government is going too far in the name of security. Are these draconian measures actually necessary to keep us safe? It's a tough question with no easy answers, maybe because it starts from such a pessimistic view of human nature. As a contrast, let's move on to John Locke, who is a little more optimistic, certainly less on the doom and gloom side. Locke had a much more positive view of human nature. In his two treatises of government, he argued that humans are born with inherent natural rights to life, liberty, and property. He saw the state of nature as a state of freedom, not as a chaotic and violent free-for-all like Hobbes. He believed humans are governed by natural law and that the social contract wasn't just about security, but about protecting these individual natural rights. He thought that the purpose of government was to safeguard those rights, not to suppress them. Locke's ideas were heavily influential on Thomas Jefferson and other American founders. Jefferson drew upon Locke's ideas when drafting the American Declaration of Independence. These ideas are built into the DNA of American democracy in many ways, even if they haven't always been executed well at times. I'd say it's been a work in progress for over 200 years, and a balancing act between Hobbesian and Lockean ideas. But here's a question: if we have these rights naturally, as Locke contends, then why do we even need a government? Couldn't we just live in a state of freedom and harmony? Well, Locke acknowledges that even in a state of nature, there would still be conflict and injustice. Without a neutral arbiter, someone to enforce the laws of nature, to protect individual rights, inevitable disputes could easily escalate into chaotic violence. Therefore, he saw the social contract as a way to create a more stable, a more just society, where those individual rights are actually more secure than they would be in a state of nature. So it's not about giving up freedom entirely, but it's about creating a framework where freedom can truly flourish. Let's think for a moment about where we see Locke's ideas today. I think we see it in the debates we have about the role and power of government in relation to individual rights. How far should the right to privacy extend in controversial areas like reproduction and body modification? What limits should be placed on freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and other forms of expression? Should citizens be allowed to bear arms, and, if so, what types of weaponry should be permitted? Where can we draw the line between individual liberty and the role of government? Even within a democracy, there's always this tension between individual expression and the need to prevent harm, a constant balancing act about where those lines should be drawn. Locke did outline what should happen when things get too far out of balance, where a government became destructive to the natural rights of its citizens. That was for people to alter or abolish their present government and form a new government to help them better secure their rights, sometimes called the right of revolution. At this point, you may be wondering, where does Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another key philosopher on the social contract, fit into all this? He had a unique perspective on the state of nature in that it was inherently good, but that society corrupts us, leading to inequality and conflict. For Rousseau, the social contract wasn't just about security or individual rights. It was about creating a society that reflects the general will, the idea of the common good, what's best for society as a whole, decided collectively. He believed that individuals should surrender some of their individual will to the general will, where it represents the good of the whole community. Yeah, you're right. That sounds tricky. Who decides what's good for everyone? And what happens when individual interests clash with this general will? That's the challenge with Rousseau's ideas. They can be a double-edged sword. They can be used as an inspiration to bring people together for a collective good, but they can also be used to justify suppressing individual rights in the name of that greater cause. So how have his ideas of the general will played out in practice? Well, when we think about things like social welfare programs, such as universal health care, public education, and so forth, those are often seen as expressions of the general will. It's kind of a collective agreement that we're all going to chip in to make sure everyone has their basic needs met. The implication is that as a society, we're all better off if everyone has access to health care, education, even if it means paying taxes and dealing with rules and regulations to support those programs. But this idea also raises questions such as individual responsibility and how much individual freedom should be sacrificed. Some people argue that these programs discourage self-reliance, creating a culture of dependency. Should people be responsible for their own well-being? Or does society have a duty to step in and do something about people who are struggling or not acting in accordance with the general will in the estimation of the majority of the society? That's basically the tension at the heart of Rousseau's concept of general will. The difficulty is in finding that sweet spot between individual freedom and collective responsibility. So how does society balance out these competing interests? Who gets to decide what the general will is? How do you prevent it from becoming this tool for tyranny of the majority, where individual rights get trampled on in the name of the general will? Proponents of Rousseau's general will concept suggest that providing safeguards, such as the codification of minority rights while protecting civil liberties and freedom of expression, should be sufficient. However, in practice, we've seen mixed results with this, and some governments have gone more in a Hobbesian, authoritarian direction when applying power. Rousseau's concept of the general will takes on new significance in the face of global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and international migration. These issues transcend national borders and require collective action on a global scale. However, the absence of any universally recognized global sovereign authority makes it difficult to achieve consensus and enforce agreements. The rise of nationalism and populism further complicates the pursuit of the general will, as narrow self-interest and identity politics often take precedence over cooperation. Some have suggested that finding ways to foster a sense of shared responsibility and global citizenship is crucial for addressing these challenges. Of course, the big question of exactly who gets to enforce these rules and how strictly to enforce them remains. Often what we've seen from politicians and planners who suggest this kind of globalism is sort of a rules for thee and not for me approach that does not sit well with most people. I think this leads into some of the criticisms of the social contract concept that have been expressed by various people. Critics challenge the historical accuracy of the so-called state of nature. They argue there's no historical evidence of any society being formed through a deliberate contract. Instead, they contend that societies emerged gradually through complex historical processes, not a single decisive agreement. Others say that the state of nature is simply a hypothetical thought experiment, not a historical reality, and not a basis for a system of government. Some have even suggested that the idea of a pre-social state of nature is an example of the noble savage trope or worse. Critics have also pointed out that the idea that simply living in a society implies consent to its rules is questionable. Can we truly say that people freely consent when they lack realistic alternatives to staying? And even if there was an original contract, such as a constitution, can it bind future generations who had no say in its creation? This raises questions about intergenerational justice and the legitimacy of inherited obligations. As we discussed, the concept of general will can be used to justify suppressing individual rights and minority views in the name of the collective good. Critics note that there's difficulty in defining the general will. Is it simply the will of the majority, or something more nuanced? They suggest that this ambiguity can be exploited for political gain. They also point out that various expressions of the social contract theory have been used in the past to exclude or marginalize groups of people. We also have to consider that social contract theory primarily focuses on the political relationship between individuals and the state. Therefore, it may not adequately address other important aspects of human life, such as family, community, and culture. Another factor is the practical enforcement of the social contract and the means of holding governments accountable given the varying interpretations of implicit consent and the right to rebellion. Do you think that the traditional frameworks, as provided by Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, offer valuable starting points for modern times? Do they need to be reinterpreted and adapted to the realities of our interconnected technological and rapidly changing world? How does the role of technology, the evolving nature of work, and the challenges of global governance fit into this debate? As you may guess, my own take is that Lockean values of individual freedom and limited government should be paramount, but we also have to consider the common good by seeking the best and personally desired outcomes for most people. As Jeremy Bentham stated as the fundamental axiom of his philosophy, it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. I expect the social contract process to be messy and complicated, with a lot of trial and error, but I see that as far preferable as compared to Hobbesian authoritarianism or Rousseau's vagueness. What are your thoughts on the social contract? Can these centuries-old concepts actually fit into the modern globalized world? Let me know what you think in the comments. I like to hear from you no matter if you agree or disagree. And, as always, like and subscribe to appease those AI overlords. Thanks again for listening to my ramblings.